They called it entertainment, explosions, vengeance, men with haunted eyes doing what needed to be done. But behind the smoke and blood of 1,970 seconds and 1,980 seconds action cinema, something else was happening. Something studios couldn't control. These weren't just stories of soldiers and killers, they were wounds disguised as movies. The heroes didn't save the world, they just tried to survive it. They came home from wars that never ended, fought ghosts no one could see, and showed an audience too comfortable to recognize itself on screen. When test screenings emptied theaters, when censors called a film emotionally dangerous, when reels vanished into vaults, it wasn't because the films failed. It was because they succeeded too well. They told the truth about a country that didn't want to hear it. This is what happens when action stops being fantasy and starts being memory. When the bullets are metaphors, and the explosions are cries for help. These are the 5 stories that went too far and no one was ready. By the late 1,970 seconds, America was exhausted. The Vietnam War had ended, but the silence that followed was heavier than the noise that came before. Hollywood, once the dream factory, began producing something darker, not escapism, but confession. Action films were no longer just spectacle. They became mirrors. Directors who had lived through the chaos or couldn't escape its shadow used the genre to speak in code. Revenge stories, war thrillers, and psychological dramas became parables for a generation that didn't know how to come home. Studios didn't want honesty. They wanted heroes who won, not men who broke. But filmmakers kept pushing back. They built stories about trauma and guilt, about systems that swallowed their own soldiers, about the quiet violence of survival. When executives demanded edits, they bled the truth out of the frames. What remained were ghosts of braver films, sanitized versions of nightmares that once dared to look real. In the years between 1,977 and 1,989, a handful of movies slipped through before being buried too raw, too disillusioned, too close to the truth. Let's go back to those years when the action genre wasn't about saving the day, but about trying to survive it. Let's go back to the 5 films that went too far and no one was ready. Rolling Thunder Etusen, Neo Hundra Judio Studio. At its test screenings, audiences didn't boo, they went silent. Some left the theater without saying a word. Not because Rolling Thunder failed, but because it revealed something too raw to process. Directed by John Flynn and written by Paul Schrader, the film follows William Devane as a Vietnam POW, returning home to a country that barely remembers him. When his wife and son are murdered in a home invasion, he doesn't grieve, he constructs a hook in place of his lost hand and begins to plan. The original cut wasn't about vengeance. It was about trauma. The violence wasn't cathartic, it was clinical. Flynn's camera lingered on silence, on small gestures, on the mechanical cruelty of pain. One infamous scene, the hook grinding against a man's flesh, was edited heavily after Fox executives called it psychologically dangerous. Schrader later said the studio had castrated the film. What survived is still powerful, but you can feel the missing heartbeat. The uncut version, rumored to be colder and more confessional, has never resurfaced. Maybe it was too honest about what returning home really meant. Maybe it wasn't revenge they feared, but recognition. 2. Who'll Stop the Rain, 1978. When Who'll Stop the Rain opened, critics expected a smuggling thriller. What they got was a Vietnam veteran unraveling in slow motion. Based on Robert Stone's novel Dog Soldiers, the film follows Nick Nolte as a disillusioned ex-soldier transporting heroin back to America. But the drugs aren't the point, they're the metaphor. The war didn't end in Saigon. It metastasized inside the men who fought it. Every frame sweats confusion and withdrawal. The gunfire feels like memory, not action. Director Karel Rice refused to glamorize anything. His Vietnam was a ghost that refused to die, and his characters were too damaged to fit back into the country that sent them away. Test audiences hated it. Some walked out. Others called it un-American. The MPAA demanded cuts for tone, not content for being too bleak. What survived release is only half of what was filmed. Foreign distributors rejected it entirely. Yet those who saw it felt something rare. The first action film that understood that survival isn't victory, it's punishment. This wasn't a story about winning or losing a war. It was about never escaping one. 384 Charlie Mopik TC 989. The soldiers didn't know they were in a horror film until they watched it later. On tape. 84 Charlie Mopik, short for motion picture photographer, was marketed as a low-budget Vietnam drama. What it actually was something more dangerous. Presented entirely through the lens of an in-universe combat cameraman, the movie never steps outside its own footage. There's no soundtrack, no sweeping hero shots, no speeches. Just handheld chaos, nervous breathing, and the kind of silences that follow gunfire. Director Patrick Sheen Duncan wanted to show what war really felt like: confusion, exhaustion, and fear disguised as bravery. Veterans who saw the film said it felt like found footage from their own nightmares. Critics praised its realism, but distributors hesitated. Some theaters refused to show it, citing psychological distress. Others accused it of undermining the honor of American soldiers. Rumors circulated that the Department of Defense discouraged screenings at military events. No proof was ever found, but the film vanished quickly after its release, surviving only through VHS copies passed between soldiers and film students. 84 Charlie Mopik isn't about victory or defeat. It's about documentation, the act of watching yourself disappear. A war movie where the camera doesn't blink, because the truth doesn't either. Fyra, Cutter's Way, et Tucson, Neo Hundra Otioet. When Cutter's Way premiered, no one clapped. Some called it anti-American. Others just didn't understand what they had seen. John Hurd plays Alex Cutter, a broken veteran, half blind, half mad, and fully aware that his country has no place for him. Jeff Bridges is his passive friend, too comfortable to act. Together, they stumble into a possible murder conspiracy involving a powerful businessman. But the mystery isn't who killed whom, it's whether anyone still believes truth matters. Director Ivan Passer shot the film like a fever dream. Every conversation feels slightly off, every smile rehearsed. The city looks normal, but something under it is rotting. Studios hated the tone. They delayed the release, changed the title, and slashed marketing. United Artists didn't want to sell disillusionment. They wanted escapism. Critics later called it a masterpiece of moral decay, a noir where the corruption isn't in the crime, but in the audience's indifference. Cutter's rage isn't madness, it's clarity. He sees that America didn't lose its soul in Vietnam, it sold it for convenience. When he finally explodes, it's not rebellion, it's recognition. Wing Fem, Sorcerer et Tusinde, o ni hundrade, o sivog halfjerds. No gunfights, no villains, just 4 men driving trucks full of nitroglycerin through the jungle and waiting for the earth itself to kill them. William Friedkin's Sorcerer was meant to be a taut thriller, a remake of The Wages of Fear. But what he created was closer to a meditation on fate and futility. Each character is a man already damned, a hitman, a revolutionary, a thief, and a corporate criminal, all exiled, all desperate, all pretending that survival still means something. filmed under punishing real conditions, with real explosions and collapsing bridges. The production became a trial in itself. The jungle consumed the crew. Trucks toppled off cliffs. Friedkin refused to fake anything because the movie wasn't about illusion. It was about control, and how quickly it slips away. When Censored premiered, audiences expecting another French Connection walked out in confusion. There were no heroes, no redemption, just a world where fate crushes everyone equally. The studio panicked, slashed its marketing, and pulled it from theaters when Star Wars arrived. Bonus fact: Winter Kills, 1979. It began as a political thriller. It ended as a mystery Hollywood never solved. Winter Kills starred Jeff Bridges as the half-brother of a U.S. president assassinated years earlier, a clear echo of the Kennedy myth. When he starts investigating, he uncovers a web of corruption so vast it makes conspiracy itself feel mundane. Every phone call is tapped, every witness dies, and every truth is rewritten before it's spoken. But the true conspiracy was off-screen. Director William Richard fought through bankrupt financiers, vanishing producers, and even 2 deaths among the film's backers, both under violent, unexplained circumstances. Production halted repeatedly as money disappeared into shell companies. Actors returned months later to finish scenes with missing sets and rewritten dialogue. When the film was finally released, the studio gave it only a token theatrical run, quietly pulling it after critics described it as too dangerous, too close to the bone. What remains is a film that feels less directed than leaked an artifact from a world where fiction and cover-up became indistinguishable. Winter Kills never found its audience. But it found something else, a reputation as the one movie that might have told the truth accidentally. Some films fail on screen, others were never even allowed to fail. In the years between 1977 and 1989, action cinema flirted with something dangerous honesty. These weren't just stories about survival or revenge. They were attempts to translate trauma into motion, to give shape to the unease of a generation that returned from war only to find a quieter kind of battlefield waiting at home. Each of these films, Rolling Thunder, Who'll Stop the Rain, 84, Charlie Mopic, Cutter's Way, Sorcerer reached for truth and paid the price. Studios re-edited, critics recoiled, audiences turned away. But the celluloid remembered. Beneath every frame of fire and fury was a question too uncomfortable for the box office. What happens when violence stops being fiction? The 1,980 seconds would soon bury these ghosts under spectacle muscle, machinery, and patriotic triumph. But the earlier decade had already whispered the truth. That action was never really about heroes saving the world. It was about wounded men trying to survive the story they were written into, and in that struggle, cinema came closest to confession. Which of these films do you think crossed the line, and which one told the truth too early? Were these directors chasing realism, or running from something they'd already seen? Tell us in the comments which forgotten action film still haunts you. And if there's another movie that went too far, that dared to show too much, bring it to light. Because some cuts were made to protect us, and others to keep us blind. Real secrets where the truth was always in the edit.